Final kind of good thing about using consumer welfare as the guide to policy is the incentives it creates for the regulated companies. Because if consumer welfare is the guide, then companies primarily make their money by trying to figure out how to provide things that consumers want and are willing to pay for, instead of spending money lobbying to try to manipulate the legislature or the regulatory system. Now, as I mentioned, there are other goals as well, part of this debate. And what do you do when you say, well, yeah, I understand consumer welfare is important, but it's not enough? And by the way, I'm talking at a real sort of high abstract level at this point. I'm also going to get into a few examples, and if you want more illustration of this, of some of these things, by all means, when we do Q&A, tell me, hey, look, get specific, will you? Well, when you're pursuing goals other than just consumer welfare, it's a good thing to try to figure out how to accomplish those other goals while sacrificing as little consumer welfare as possible if the policies you need to accomplish those goals actually, to some extent, diminish consumer welfare. How do you do that? Well, first of all, it helps to know what you are specifically what you're trying to accomplish through that other policy. If it's a universal service policy, if it's a public safety policy, identify the specific outcome you're trying to create, and actually identify a way of measuring it so that we know afterward whether the policy really did produce that outcome or not, and if so, how much. Measure the outcome. Measure the outcome. Then, this is something that sometimes in public policy we forget about. Identify alternatives. I mean, we know if we know the outcome we want to achieve, it kind of makes sense to think, well, what are the different ways we could go about trying to achieve it, rather than just saying, let's do what we always did in the past, or let's do this neat, cool idea that one person thought about. Think about a range of alternatives and try to figure out how each alternative will affect the amount of the outcome. How might different approaches to universal service, for example, affect the availability of and affordability of telecom services or broadband in rural areas, rather than just saying, well, doing this kind of subsidy to this kind of carrier is the way we've always done it, so we're just going to keep doing that. Figure out how each alternative will affect consumer welfare. In some cases, when you pursue one of these other objectives, you have to sacrifice some consumer welfare. For example, the public safety considerations tend to raise the cost of telephone service. Telephone service with E911 costs somewhat more to provide than telephone service without E911. We ought to think about how consumers will respond to that change in prices and how much consumer welfare we may sacrifice if we tell consumers, yes, you're going to pay a higher price because we think you need to have this service. That doesn't mean it's not a bad idea to mandate 911. Just means we need to understand the trade-offs we're making. And finally, once we know what the trade-offs are, there's a policy decision, which is trying to figure out, okay, how much consumer welfare are we willing to give up in order to achieve universal service, public safety goals, raise a certain amount of tax revenue, or whatever. Now, this ain't rocket science, really. I mean, it's hardly even economics. If you could find a book that had these principles in it, you know what it'd be called? It'd be called Decision-Making for Dummies. Because really what this boils down to is figure out what you're trying to do and then figure out the best way to do it. And if you have to give up something, then weigh the pros and cons. That's it. Sometimes this is controversial in regulatory circles. I mean, when we do regulatory analysis in the federal government, some people hate the idea of doing these kind of things, partly because it's a lot of work and partly because it upsets apple carts. But this is really just sort of, decision-making 101. Peter Drucker probably wrote this someplace. I haven't been able to find it yet, but he probably wrote it someplace. Okay, well, if we take consumer welfare as one of the important goals, what are the kind of things that tend to promote consumer welfare in most industries? Well, here's a list. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's a lot of the major kinds of things. Competition tends to promote consumer welfare. Consumers get a lot of choices. Prices are about as low as they can realistically be, given the alternatives and the costs of producing stuff. There's opportunities for innovation because folks are trying to do better than their competitors. You have markets that are open to entry and to exit, which is part of the whole competitive process. You have freedom to set prices for services and for bundles of services, freedom to bundle services together and offer the customer a better price for a bundle than for a la carte. You have freedom to innovate and reap rewards for it. And you know, I forgot something really important in that bullet. It's not just freedom to innovate, introduce new services or new bundles and reap rewards, but also the freedom to innovate and reap the losses if you made a mistake. Because the losses are what, you know, the stick that gets folks to stop doing things that actually create less value for consumers than they cost. Prevention of fraud and deception. You know, you can't let folks lie, cheat, and steal. And the other thing that helps promote consumer welfare is when, if you're regulating for some other purpose, you do it in such a way that minimizes the sacrifice of consumer welfare. Now, what has telecom regulation done historically, however? Well, in a lot of ways, kind of the opposite. Now, I want to make clear, I am not saying, by putting up this slide, that current Ohio telecom regulation does all these things. In fact, I don't know that any state telecom regulation currently does all of these things now. But this is what the old historic institution of monopoly regulation tended to do. This is what we are evolving away from in telecom towards something that's more of a competitive market. And so if we're trying to figure out, well, how do we do reform? One way we can figure that out is look at this list and then look at what the state is doing and say, gee, to what extent are we still doing stuff that looks sort of like this? In some cases, you may look at it and say, well, wait, you know, we already fixed that. You know, we don't do that anymore. And that makes sense. As I said, I wouldn't expect to see any state does all this stuff. Although from our description this morning, maybe Indiana was doing most of this until a year or two ago. But, you know, historically, telecom regulation did the opposite of a lot of things that economists would say normally promote consumer welfare. It tended to enforce monopoly, tends to prevent exit. That's what, you know, partly what provider of last resort is all about. If you're the provider of last resort in a territory, you can't just up and stop serving it because you decided it's too expensive. You have to get permission first, and chances are you might not be able to get permission. Tended to mandate fairly rigid prices, and you know, as Hans mentioned earlier, tended to result in various kinds of cross subsidies where certain kind of customers were taxed, quote, taxed, in order to subsidize services to others. In some cases, this was very opaque, as in, say, the rate structure where you have a telephone company that serves urban areas and rural areas, and they're told, well, you have to charge everybody about the same price. Or in Texas, which is one of the states I've studied, they actually had lower prices for local service in rural areas than in urban areas. I mean, it wasn't even rate equalization. It was like the opposite of the way costs go. That's kind of an opaque type of subsidy. On the other hand, the most transparent subsidy is probably the way the federal government does universal service, where if you look at your phone bill, you will see a line item where you're being charged to pay money into the Universal Service Fund that subsidizes phone service in rural areas for low-income folks, internet service for schools and libraries, and so forth. That's the USF programs have other problems, but at least they are explicit, and the Federal Communications Commission's goal was to make them very explicit. Often, traditional monopoly regulation discouraged new services and bundling. It a lot of times prevented fraud and deception, which is a good thing, but sometimes the consumer protection aspects of monopoly regulation went further than preventing lying, cheating, and stealing to make some of customers' choices for them. I mean, that's kind of what quality of service standards are all about. Quality of service standards are not necessarily here's the standard that would have existed in a competitive market if competition had existed, and somehow we did research so that we know this is what consumers would have chosen, but rather this is the regulators or the legislators' best judgment about what we think the minimum service quality standards should be. And in a monopoly situation, there's probably no avoiding it, because once you regulate entry, create a monopoly, and then regulate prices, one of the ways the company can kind of cheat and earn higher profits at the expense of consumers is what? Degrade the quality of service. So while the quality of service standards may be a natural part of monopoly regulation, in a competitive environment where you can go to somebody else if you don't like the service, it's not quite the same thing.